The Significant Contribution to Public Health with Luther T. Terry. Luther T. Terry was born in Red Level, Alabama on 1911 in the month of September. He was a man who accomplished a lot and was very involved in public health. He also taught during the most of his life. In 1931, Luther obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Birmingham Southern University in 1935 and his MD degree at Tulane University in 1938. 3 years later, he moved to Washington to intern in pathology at the Washington University. Between 1940 to 1942, he began teaching as an instructor at the University of Texas. In 1942, he then became the Public Health Service's Chief of Medical Services. During the early 1950s, Terry began his cardiovascular research to prove to the people that smoking was the cause of many cardiovascular diseases. During that time, he became the Chief of General Medicine and Experimental Therapeutics at the National Heart Institute. In 1953, the very first Heart Institute was opened, and Terry was appointed the first chairman of the medical board of the Clinical Center from 1953 to 1955. During that time, from 1944 to 1961, he became the assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, in which he and his team began the golden era of cardiovascular clinical investigation. And in 1958, he then became the assistant director of the National Heart Institute. I would say he really loved what he did. After the cardiovascular clinical investigation research was over, Terry quit smoking in 1963 to show to the public that clearly cigarette smoking is the cause of cancer and other cardiovascular diseases. Terry then released his report to the advisory committee as the Surgeon General of the United States in 1964. Regarding smoking and health, and later the Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act was passed. Then in 1965, Terry was able to work with the agencies to help ban advertisements on radios and televisions, as well as smoking in the work areas. And the late 70s, in the early 70s, he became the vice president for medical affairs and then began his lectures as the professor at the University of Pennsylvania for 4 years. And in 1975, he became the adjunct professor. 1981, which was actually the year I was born, Terry retired his profession as a professor and was given the name Emeritus Professor, which means successful professor. However, he still continued his last few years as the corporate vice president of medical affairs for ARA Services of Philadelphia until 1983. And in 1985, Terry died at the age of 73 from heart failure. He was a very ambitious man who devoted his life to his work. He was also married and he had 3 children of his own. And I quote, "The most influential general in the United States history, his 1964 report on the paralysis of smoking not only gave smokers the urge to kick the habit, but it led to the ubiquitous Surgeon General's warning printed on cigarette packaging and advertising, end quote. So now we're going to go over the history of on the Surgeon General. Um, the position was created after the Civil War, and the Surgeon General was overseeing the national hospital system of the United States Marine Hospital Service. And this was the very first hospital that was developed during this time, and it was developed to help veterans that fought during the Civil War. He was the commanding officer of the Pacific Health Service Commission Corps, and in 1973 to 1977, the Surgeon General lost his Anatomy for Public Health Corps. However, President Jimmy Carter reassigned the position to the Department of Health and Human Services, and when President Reagan became the president, he sustained the position ever since. The climate of the time period in terms of political during Terry's era was at its peak due to the tobacco and alcohol sales, which heightened tension between countries from overseas trades. After the Great Depression and during the World War II, tobacco companies offered jobs with very poor wages to many underground crimes. During the time of Terry's research, President Kennedy appointed Terry the general surgeon, and he was given the opportunity to learn more on the health and smoking and was able to offer that to the public. In terms of the socio-economic factors of Terry's era, poverty was a huge stressor during this time. Many men looking for jobs to support families, which the mortality rate in men actually decreased to about 70%. So the public was actually welcoming Terry's work and learning the health problems that were caused from smoking. However, Hollywood actors depicting smoking in films was causing a controversy against Terry's report because it kind of glamorized smoking as it showed the beauty of smoking and not the harmful effects of it. The environmental of Terry's era was a time of poaching, hunting, and destroying land to promote tobacco companies. It was more on rise than the work that Terry was trying to promote. Booming of harvest tobacco fields overseas made trading a high market investment. People were, and they're still about making money than they are on their health. So those are the type of people that rejected Terry's work. Epidemiologists made a point that the air pollution, abyssal contamination, or radioactive materials was the epidemic cause of lung cancer. Well, I mean, it could have been a risk factor, but I think that smoking was a higher risk factor than that. The technological factors was used for many advertisements of many companies, and Terry was able to ban cigarette ads on television and as well as radio communication after the Communication Act was passed in 1971. Many tobacco companies rejected this act due to the amount of money they lost from marketing the products to customers. Why did Terry believe in his work? Okay, and I quote, Terry established the Surgeons General Advisory Committee on Smoking and Health that concluded the epidemic rise in lung cancer and chronic bronchitis were related to cigarette smoking, end quote. And he also believed and proved that smokers had a shorter lifespan than non-smokers, and other health-related factors such as bronchitis and other cardiovascular diseases. North Carolina is known as the tobacco company or the tobacco country. The Politicians, farmers, and tobacco industries were not too happy regarding Terry's report regarding smoking causing lung cancer. In fact, they fought and, quote, asserted Terry and his scientists and all of their statistics were mistaken in their conclusion, end quote. One of the farmers predicted that this story, as he called it, would be forgotten. A politician stated that the conclusion was made up. However, the federal government made a decision to declare war on smoking, on tobacco, and on crops, in which changed North Carolina's economy. So many farmers were forced to sell their land due to the decrease in economy. President Kennedy hired Terry as the general surgeon as they worked closely on the report, and before Terry was able to publish the report, President Kennedy was assassinated. However, there was no evidence that it could have been related to the report, but it was known that many underground crime families ran the tobacco industries. After the report was published, many farmers sold their crops due to the decrease in tobacco market. In 1964, there were over 87,576 tobacco farmers, and in 2007, the number of farmers have decreased to 2,622. That's a huge drop. Tobacco companies had over 60,000 employees and nearly 250 million in annual wages. So a lot of people lost their jobs after the report was published. State budgets also declined. Not only was North Carolina suffering from the decline of state budgets, but many other states suffered from the $2 billion the federal government brought in from tobacco taxes in 1963. Terry's overall contribution after the report was published was the reduction of the mortality rates, lung cancer, laryngeal cancer, and other heart diseases related to smoking. However, there are still 42 million Americans who still smoke, and 8 million are living with chronic illnesses caused by smoking. If you compare that to 50 years ago, it's an 18% decrease. So Terry also contributed to the cigarette advertising being banned in broadcasting and also smoking in the workplace. He was able to create health warnings on cigarette packs regarding health risk. Besides the decline of tobacco industries, North Carolina was able to rebuild their economy by increasing agricultures. Farmers started investing in livestock and hog production, in which had a dramatic rise at 2.5 million and still continues to climb. North Carolina also created a five-leg economy built around pharmaceuticals, technology, and food processing, financial services, and vehicle parts. 50 years later, 20% adult smoke compared to 50% in 1964. So since the release of Luther Terry's Surgeon General's report of 1964, conclusions were built on more than 7,000 studies on smoking and concluded for the first time that smoking caused lung cancer in men and likely in women, and smoking was the cause of chronic bronchitis. So the estimated life expectancy at 40 increased to 7.8% for men and 5.4% for women. Tobacco control increased to 2.3 additional years for men and 1.6 additional years for women, which the overall smoking rates worldwide decreased to 42% in women and 25% in men. So you can see that a lot of men smoke from then until now. So that concludes my presentation on Luther T. Terry. These are the references I used for my research. I hope you enjoyed my presentation and thank you for listening.